House of the Dragon Season 2 is almost here, and one of the main plot points in Season 2 is going to be the Dragonseeds. Now, in today's video, we're not going to be talking about Season 2 of House of the Dragon, so there won't be any spoilers or anything like that, but I do want to have a little bit of a chat about the idea of Dragonseeds in general. So we're going to explain what they are, and then we're going to take a look at some characters in our main series of books that may be Dragonseeds or Dragonseed adjacent, depending on what definition for Dragonseed you want to use. So generally speaking, the Dragonseeds are the bastard children of House Targaryen born with a common mother. This happened a lot back in the day on Dragonstone before the First Night was abolished, and continued to happen occasionally after that. The First Night was a hated practice amongst the small folk of Westeros for very obvious reasons, but allegedly it was more accepted on Dragonstone because they viewed their Targaryen rulers as closer to gods, and would say that if a woman became pregnant from the rite of the First Night, she was blessed with a dragon seed, and this is where the name Dragonseeds originated. Now, there's some conversation to be had there if that's just Targaryen propaganda coming down through the history books, being like, no, our small folk really loved it when we abused them actually. We were different than all of those other lords who weren't as cool about it. But nonetheless, that's where the name comes from. Now, the reason I said some of these people may be Dragonseed adjacent is because I don't know if you only consider the direct descendant from that, Targaryen and not his wife to be a Dragonseed, or if you consider their descendants as well to be Dragonseeds. Those people are often described as having a drop of dragon blood in them. So if that's the phrase you want to use to describe them and keep that a little bit of a distinction, that's fine. But we're going to be talking about both cases in this video. Now, in House of the Dragon, the dragon seeds are brought up because there are many unridden dragons who would be useful if they were on your side in the war. So the idea of finding some dragon seeds who have enough dragon blood in them to tame and ride these dragons is something that is going to be explored in Season 2. This could be interesting going forward in future books because Daenerys notably has two dragons that need riders. She's going to be only able to bond with one, and that appears like it's going to be Drogon, leaving her other two dragons in need of a rider, and from what it looks like, that rider may need to have Targaryen blood. So when I bring up these characters, I do just want to make the disclaimer that I'm not saying all of them are going to be potentially dragon riders, but you can go ahead and make your own theories about which of these candidates I bring up you think are most likely to try and ride a dragon. So with that being said, I'm going to start with some of the lesser known characters first and kind of work my way up to some of the more main candidates that are talked about quite often. The first minor character I'd like to bring up as a potential dragon seed was someone who was actually pointed out to me by Taco from Something to Talk About. Over on his channel, he's actually doing a super long series covering basically every minor character in these books that he can find, and so he's sort of my minor character guy. I'm basically like Rick from Pawn Stars. I have a guy for that now. You get a big enough YouTube channel and you suddenly start getting a guy for things. So when I brought up the idea of minor characters as dragon seeds, he had one ready to go right away. He suggested Clayton Suggs, and the more you look into the evidence, it actually really does line up pretty well that George could be hinting that maybe this guy is descended from a Targaryen somewhere. The first point in favor of Clayton Suggs being a potential dragon seed is the fact that he is of low birth and comes from Fleabottom. And obviously this is a good location to expect a potential dragon seed to be hanging out. It is, of course, close enough to the Red Keep that there would be some potential Targaryen interaction with the common folk there, and of course we did see that scene in Season 1 of House of the Dragon, where a bunch of Aegon's lowborn children were apparently hanging out in the streets of King's Landing. In addition to the fact that he comes from the right location, he also has an obsession with burning people, which is obviously something that the Mad King had, and is a very Targaryen obsession to have. Every time something seems to go wrong for Stannis' camp, he suggests that they burn some more people for R'hllor, so that hopefully they can get his blessing and fix whatever's going wrong. And you may be tempted to think perhaps he's not fire obsessed, perhaps he's just a very devout worshipper of R'hllor who fully buys into the idea that burning people could fix their problems. But George seems to very clearly address this point through the eyes of Asha Greyjoy when she thinks that she's seen him staring into the flames, and it's not the god he loves, it's the flames. So he's from the right area, and he's fire obsessed, and if we take Season 1 of House of the Dragon into account, there is another little hint that could point towards a Clayton Suggs Targaryen connection. the fact that his sigil is a winged pig, which of course we all remember the scene in season 1 of House of the Dragon when they brought out the Pink Dread, who was of course just a pig with wings strapped to it. Now, that one's probably not any actual connection, but I did think it was kind of interesting and worth mentioning that he chose a winged pig for his sigil. In terms of whether or not Clayton Suggs will potentially ride a dragon, my bet would be a definite no, he will not. Not only because I don't think that he's necessarily going to end up anywhere near a dragon at any point where it's relevant, but also because something that I've often heard is that George apparently named the character Clayton Suggs after Mark Clayton and Terrell Suggs, who were two players for the Baltimore Ravens right around the time Dance with Dragons came out. Now, I'm not completely sure if that's true, but it's something that I've heard repeated a bunch of times, and it would be right up George's alley. He had a character who has a Dallas Cowboys logo for his sigil get smashed to death by a giant, so he likes to make little football references in his world building and in his story. Very specifically references to the New York Giants. 1-1 got his name for Phil Simms, who wore number 11, or 1-1. He also put a figure in the world building called Triarch Belleccio, who is named after Bill Belichick, and he had a undefeated campaign where he won 18 straight battles and then was unexpectedly eaten by giants, as a reference to the Patriots who went 18-0 before losing to the Giants in the Super Bowl. Now, George was writing these two books, Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, in the early 2000s, and even though Dance didn't come out until 2011, he had been working on it for quite some time at that point. The other thing that happened in the early 2000s was the Baltimore Ravens defeated the New York Giants in the Super Bowl. So if he's naming a character after a couple of Baltimore Ravens players, well, I think it's very likely that Clayton Suggs will probably meet a very unfortunate end. If he does try to tame a dragon, I could see him just getting roasted alive and burned the way that he loved to burn so many other people. In universe, it would be a fitting end for a character who loved to burn people alive, and in footballing terms, it would have been an absolutely great dunk on the Baltimore Ravens had it not taken so long for the next book to come out that Terrell Suggs and Mark Clayton have both since retired from football. So again, I'm not entirely sure that that's why the character was named as he was, but it would make sense to me, and I'm not entirely sure that Clayton Suggs is a dragon seed, but it would make some sense to me. The next very minor character, who you probably don't remember because I didn't remember until I started looking around for people from Fleabottom who could potentially be dragon seeds, is a character whose name is Kem, and he had an older brother called Kemet. Tyrion meets Kem over in Essos when he's with a sellsword company in Dance with Dragons, and Kem is very obviously from Fleabottom, Tyrion can tell because of his accent. He tells Tyrion that his older brother died in the Battle of the Blackwater, and that he hates Tywin Lannister for the sack of King's Landing, which does sound like a Targaryen thing to do, hating on Tywin Lannister. In addition to this, he has pale blonde hair, which is the right color to be a potential dragon seed, but then again, we really don't know anything else about this guy, so it's all very minor stuff, and I'm not saying he is actually a dragon seed, but if the next book comes out and he does some sort of dragon seed type thing, you heard it here first. Kem and Kemet from Fleabottom could potentially have been descended from Targaryens somewhere at some point. Rest in pieces, Kemet. Another minor character who Tyrion meets over in Essos who actually claims himself to have a drop of dragon blood is Brown Ben Plum. And when Tyrion does the math and tries to think of who he may be descended from, Tyrion himself thinks that he actually has 2 drops of dragon blood. So whether or not that will come in handy or be relevant at all, who really knows, but George has planted that little seed there. Now moving away from the minor characters to some of the characters that you've definitely heard about before, let's just get this one out of the way right away. Jon Snow is very likely descended from Rhaegar Targaryen. The only argument about whether or not Jon Snow is a dragon seed comes from the idea that he was also born to a noble mother, and honestly his parents may have been married. I'm not here in this particular video to argue one way or another on that, but let me know what you guys think and you can fight about it down in the comments. Does Jon Snow qualify as a dragon seed if he's born to a noble mother? And if his parents were married or not married, does that affect his status as a dragon seed or not? Very clearly, he is a Targaryen, but is he a dragon seed? Let me know what you all think. The next character that I want to talk about quickly is Marwin the Mage. When Sam meets him at the Citadel, he says a very cryptic line that seems to imply that he has the blood of the dragon on some level or another. He blames the Maesters and the Citadel for getting rid of dragons the first time around, and says that that's the reason Aemon Targaryen is allowed to waste away his life up on the wall, rather than be raised to the rank of Archmaester. He says that the Citadel can't trust him because of his blood, and then says, no more than they can trust me, implying that he also has some untrustworthy blood, and potentially the blood of the dragon. Now, we don't know a lot about where Marwin comes from or anything like that. We don't have a ton of information about him at all, really, so there's a lot of room here for speculation. One of my favorite theories about this is something that I first heard from the Interesting Nerd Club. I don't know if it's older than this, it probably is, but I'm not sure. But it's the idea that Marwin is potentially a Bright Flame. Descended from Aryan Bright Flame when he was over in Essos, the Bright Flame lineage was originally supposed to be like his bastard lineage, that was originally probably going to be what the Blackfires are today, before George had come up with them in the world building. And then as he wrote future books, he sort of replaced the Bright Flames with the Blackfires. You can tell because there was no mention of the Blackfires in the early books, but they're obviously a very important part of the history now, so it's unclear if the Bright Flames still have any role in the story at all. But if they do, I think it would be kind of interesting if Marwin was a male descendant from this line at some point. It is worth mentioning, though, that we really don't know anything for sure about the Bright Flames, if there are even any descendants of Aerion in Essos somewhere, but he was exiled there for a long time, and it feels like hints were dropped and then nothing was really done with it. So let me know if you guys have heard that theory before and what you think of it. Do you like the idea of Marwin Brightflame? Or do you think possibly Marwin is a dragon seed on some level from somewhere else? Let me know again what you think about all of these down in the comments. I personally think the fact that Marwin is going to meet up with Daenerys could put him in a pretty decent position to at least try to ride a dragon if he does indeed have blood of the dragon somewhere. Like, if anyone has the magical knowledge combined with the magical blood required to potentially tame a wild dragon, it seems like Marwin is a pretty good candidate. He would have access to all of the books that would hold the magical knowledge that he needs, he would have an interest in learning this stuff, he would potentially have the right bloodline, and he is potentially going to be in the right location to tame a dragon. I would say that Jon Snow is the only character who for sure comes in ahead of Marwin on this list in terms of likeliness to ride a dragon. Now, before we move off of the idea of potential descendants of Aerion Brightflame when he was off in Essos, another character who I've seen brought up as a potential for this is the Tattered Prince. Tatters definitely has the right look to be a Targaryen. He has the silvery gray hair, but this could also just come from the fact that he's pretty old. I've seen it pointed out how wearing a cloak made of the tatters of many of the cloaks of all of the men that you've slain in battle is very similar to sitting on a throne of all of the swords of all of the people you've defeated in battle. So the tattered cloak and the Iron Throne kinda have some similar symbolism going on, but I don't know if that's anything that you would take to actually say Tatters is a Targaryen. When he was younger, he was at one point named the Prince of Pentos, which in Pentos, the prince is basically just a figurehead who they use to sacrifice whenever something goes wrong. So they basically put you in charge, and then as soon as the weather goes bad and the crops fail or something like that, anytime something's going really bad, they take the prince out and they cut his head off to say that, see, the gods were punishing us because the prince was bad, we'll elect a new prince and then everything will be fine and get back to normal. This basically allows the Magisters to avoid any of the blame from the small folk from anything that ever goes wrong. When Tatters was elected to this position at the age of 23, he said, nope, I'm definitely not doing that, and he left and founded a sellsword company. This was definitely a pretty good move on his part, but the thing that is kind of interesting to me is who was he that they chose him to be the Prince of Pentos when he was just 23 years old? If he was known to be of Targaryen descent, he could potentially have been considered important enough to be a young man who was elected to be the prince. There is also the fact that he keeps his true name to himself, so this whole situation really is sort of seemingly building up some mystery around the true identity of the Tattered Prince. Could he be a dragon seed or a Targaryen descendant somewhere? Let me know what you think about all that down in the comments. I don't personally have any strong feelings one way or the other about the identity of the Tattered Prince, and I don't really have too many strong feelings about many of these characters, whether they are or are not dragon seeds. It's not one of those types of videos where I'm trying to tell you what I think is going on. I'm just trying to create basically a big list of potential things that could be going on. Now that I've established that, let's completely contradict it, and I'm going to tell you some people who are absolutely definitely descended from Targaryens, and specifically from a dragon seed. That is, all of the Baratheons. So, therefore, all of Bobby B's bastards have a little bit of dragon blood in them. And considering that they are bastards, this could technically qualify them as dragon seeds, again, depending on your definition and how much dragon blood you consider them needing to actually qualify. House Baratheon was originally founded by a dragon seed, Orys Baratheon, who was the half-brother of Aegon the Conqueror. In addition to this, Robert Stannis and Renly's grandmother was another Targaryen, so they've double-dipped on the Targaryen lineage, and one of them has been pretty recent in the family tree. So that means that yes, Edric Storm has dragon blood, Gendry has dragon blood, Maya Stone has dragon blood, and for a guy who wants to destroy all Targaryens, Bobby B sure does seem to make a lot of them. It's actually the fact that he is so closely related to the Targaryens originally and then again recently that was the reason that Bobby B was chosen to be the king after they got rid of the Targaryens. He was actually like right on up there in the line of succession. They obviously took the throne by conquest, but when they got together and tried to decide how they were going to legitimize this new rule, they chose Robert out of all of the options because of that, and so therefore the amount of dragon blood that the Baratheons have is a pretty interesting thing going forward in these books. I'm not sure if we're ever going to get a scenario sort of like the Dragonseeds, where Dany is sitting there in Westeros with 2 extra dragons and looking for someone who can ride them, but if she did, then all of Bobby B's bastards would potentially be able to put themselves forward. Gendry, Edric Storm, all of them, throwing their hat in the ring to try and ride a dragon. I again don't really think that will happen, but it could, and it would be kinda cool. Speaking of someone who is distantly descended from a Targaryen trying to ride a dragon, we did actually get one instance of this in the main series, that is Quentyn Martell. He tried to tell Daenerys about his Targaryen heritage, but she rejected his marriage proposal anyway, and then at one point he's trying to tell Garrus about how he's descended from the Targaryens when he's talking about trying to tame a dragon, and he says, I have a bit of Targaryen blood in me. You know that I can trace my lineage back. Fuck your lineage, said Garrus. The dragons won't care about your blood, except maybe how it tastes. You cannot tame a dragon with a history lesson. So basically, he interrupts him to just say, no one cares, especially not the dragons, if you are distantly descended from the Targaryens. Now, that may or may not be true, it remains to be seen, but in any case, it doesn't seem to have worked out very well for Quentyn. Now for a few Dragonseed theories that some people really like and some people really hate. The first of these that we're going to talk about is the Lannister children. It's said that Aerys the Mad King had a thing for Joanna Lannister, and it's also said that he took certain liberties with the bedding ceremony. Now, I think this definitely falls short of implying that he full on tried to invoke the Lord's right of the first night, and if he had done that, I think there would have been much more of an issue made of it. It would have probably been a bigger deal, and Tywin would have hated him even more even earlier on. The thing that I think keeps this entire theory alive in the fandom in terms of the Lannister twins is the whole incest thing. They have a very Targaryen brother and sister relationship. I personally think it would be kind of funny if the twins were Targaryens, just because of the fact then that Robert Baratheon is the only brief break that you have in Targaryen sitting on the Iron Throne, given that Joffrey and Tommen would then be secretly Targaryens, and also inbred Targaryens at that. But as I said, Robert Baratheon himself is also pretty closely descended from the Targaryens, and just timeline-wise, I don't think it necessarily really works out for the twins to be secret Targaryens, but for a couple reasons it would be funny. If I had to place my bet, I would say it's probably unlikely, but you can see why the theory kind of persists amongst some fans. The timeline issues that I brought up are the fact that apparently Joanna Lannister left King's Landing in 263 and the twins weren't born until 266, and apparently at no point was she anywhere near Aerys during the time that she would have conceived them. However, in Tyrion's case, that is actually not true. She apparently went to visit King's Landing for a tourney in 272, and Tyrion was born in 273. So there is a bit of room for some shenanigans to have gone on with the birth of Tyrion. Tyrion also has a bit of a love for dragons and a bit of a love for fire that was mentioned early on in the books. Tyrion apparently had dreams as a child about dragon fire burning his family alive as he watched, And so that could be a Targaryen-y thing to dream about if you want to take it in that direction. It could have also been foreshadowing from the original plotline that George had outlined, where Tyrion was going to be the one to burn and sack Winterfell. It would be very interesting for several reasons if Tyrion was the son of the Mad King. Obviously, Tywin would have plenty of reason to hate the Mad King, and it would put some new context on certain things that Tywin said, like saying how he couldn't prove Tyrion wasn't his, or saying that you are no son of mine. Many people really hate this theory because they think it ruins the whole Tyrion Tywin father son relationship. I don't personally think it would ruin that much. I think that it would kind of still be pretty interesting, in the same way that Rhaegar being Jon's father doesn't really change his father son relationship that he had with Ned. Also, there's the fact that in the case of Tyrion, I don't think that we're ever going to know, and I don't think Tywin himself even knew. If the Mad King did sleep with Joanna when she was at that tourney in King's Landing, I think that it's very likely that Tywin himself was also sleeping with his wife around the same time, so he can never be entirely sure who the father actually is. That fact leads nicely into discussion of another theory that I actually kind of really like, the idea that Tyrion is potentially a chimera. As in, there was another situation where there were two eggs there to be fertilized in the same way that the twins were, but then they fused into one baby. This is a thing that can actually happen, and the mismatched eyes that Tyrion has could potentially be a hint towards this. But there's actually something that I think is an even stronger hint that is meant to make us think about this possibility. This is when he's staying with Illyrio and he's told about Meleys the Monstrous, who was called the Monstrous for his grotesque appearance, where he had a second head growing out of his shoulder that was tiny. This is another situation that is probably the result of an absorbing of a twin. That night, Tyrion has a dream that he has a second head just like Meleys the Monstrous, and he's fighting in a battle with Barristan Selmy, and he's slaying his father and his brother. As he does this, his second head weeps. This would be some pretty good foreshadowing if we ever found out that Tyrion was in fact a Targaryen who had absorbed the Lannister twin, one of them fertilized by the Mad King, one of them by Tywin, and so he's sort of a mix of Targaryen and Lannister, sort of half Tywin's son and half the Mad King's son. His second head weeping could be the Lannister head that he eventually absorbed, that is sad that his family's being killed, whereas Tyrion is excited about it. Now, this is another one of those things that I don't think we're ever going to actually get confirmation about. I don't think Westerosi science is up on the level where we can ever find out what exactly happened if Tyrion is actually a chimera. So this little hint may never actually become foreshadowing, it may just be a little hint that is there to tempt us to think about the idea. It's again nothing that I think George likes to do, where he likes us to think about these things, but he's never going to fully confirm them one way or the other. The only way I could really see this being confirmed that Tyrion has dragon blood in him or that he is potentially descended from the Mad King is if we get really good confirmation that that is a requirement to ride a dragon, and then Tyrion does eventually end up riding one of Dany's dragons. And he did have that whole saddle building thing that was a part of the first book, so perhaps he could design a saddle for himself to eventually ride a dragon, if that is the direction that the story goes. For me, overall, the Tyrion Targaryen theory is one that I find interesting, and it's fully a coin flip. I don't know that we're ever going to know, but the version of the theory that I prefer is the one where he is a chimera, just because I think that would be kind of cool. It would explain his mismatched eyes, and it would explain that dream where he has a second head that seems to sympathize more with the Lannisters. Now, for one more theory that some people really seem to like and some people really, really hate, we have, of course, Dany Dragonseed. This is the idea that basically there was a baby swap that went on, and Daenerys was actually just a random dragon seed from Dragonstone who was whisked away with Viserys to say that she was the daughter of Rhaella when really she wasn't. There are definitely some inconsistencies with Daenerys' childhood memory, such as the lemon tree outside of the house with the red door, which she believes to be in Bravos, and none of that really makes any sense. There's also that whole bit about Quaithe telling her, "Remember who you are, Daenerys." But that also I don't really think necessarily points to her being a dragon seed who was brought in as a baby, and I would say swapped, but this isn't really even a baby swap. The idea would be that Rhaella would have had a stillbirth or died giving birth to a baby that didn't make it, and then therefore they were like, well, let's just grab a random descendant of a Targaryen from Dragonstone and send it off with Viserys and say that that was his sister. Why anyone would want to do this, I'm not really sure, other than to just hopefully give the Targaryen dynasty a little bit better chance of surviving if there are two heirs rather than one. But if they know it wasn't a legitimate Targaryen anyway, I don't really see what the end goal there would be, unless they just think, okay, well, a random dragon seed was good enough. Maybe they had some grand plan and knew it would be useful to have a daughter for a marriage alliance in the future to help with Viserys's trying to take back the kingdoms. That is a thing that could be possible, I suppose. But again, I don't know that we really have any great evidence that Dany is a dragon seed. I think we do have some pretty good evidence that she has Targaryen descent because she was able to hatch dragons, which seems like a thing that only a Targaryen would do. But of course, her being a dragon seed would also qualify her from that, so her being able to hatch dragons doesn't necessarily rule out the idea that she's a dragon seed. And another thing that I often see arguing against the idea of Dany being a dragon seed that I just want to address is the idea that Viserys would be able to tell if there was some sort of baby swap or if it wasn't actually his sister. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that he would be pretty easy to fool given that he's pretty young. And think about it, if you are an older sibling yourself, try to remember back to the first time you saw your baby sibling. Someone just presents you with a baby and they're like, oh, here's your little sister. If that wasn't actually the correct baby the first time and every other time you see them after that, it's always the same baby, how are you ever going to tell? As long as it looks enough like you to pass, you're never going to know. So it's not that there's anything that firmly rules this out, in my opinion. Like, I don't think it's impossible that Dany isn't actually who she thinks she is. I just think that it would sort of be a needless complication to the story, and I've never really heard a compelling reason that it would happen. I think that a lot of the inconsistencies about Dany's childhood point to other things rather than that she was swapped as a baby with a stillbirth or a baby that didn't make it through the storming of Dragonstone. But I am, as always, open minded, so if there are any of you down in the comments who are very strong believers in the Dany Dragonseed theory and have a well thought out version of it that I haven't thought of or seen so far, definitely let me know down in the comments and people can debate it down there. In addition to that, if there are any dragon seeds or dragon seed candidates in the main series that I may have forgotten about, definitely let me know about it. But for now, that's all I've got for you, so thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you made it to the end of this, and I'll be back with something else very soon.